Our presenter today is Steve MacKley. Steve is the UX director at Beaconfire RED. He brings more than 15 years of experience in the digital space. He blends the art and science of UX design, bridging IA, analytics, and user research with branding, digital marketing, and visual design. Please welcome Steve.
Everyone. Thank you for the introduction, David, and thank you to Easy for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Today we're going to talk about for 2017 and beyond. I'd like to start off by saying when we talk about design trends, we're not just talking about things that new and emerging practices that were at one point innovation and now we would consider them to be just generally accepted best practices. Run an entire new to the you really should be doing this, and we're seeing coming to a pivot point in 2017. Just for background, my name is Steve MacKley. I'm the Director of User Experience and Design at Beaconfire RED. Beaconfire RED is a firm that's been around since 2001, and we've helped roughly 20 nonprofits grow. We create digital campaigns, design user-centric websites and apps, technology solutions, and focus on engaging visitors. And Beaconfire RED may focus on non-for-profits. My background also includes the for-profit sector as well, such as Crate and Barrel, Walgreens, and Sears Roebuck as well. So bringing a very wide array of background experience to what in terms of the that we're starting to encounter. And just as a reminder from what David said, if at any point you have questions, please free Q&A section. Absolutely time at the end to answer any of those questions that come up. So please note them, jot them down, and we're happy to answer them as well. We're going to go through 10 I see emerging or coalescing in 2017. And the first one will seem fairly obvious to anyone who's working, but we've seen some pivot in the last year or so, and that's designing for multi-channel content. And what I think is changing or emerging in 2017 is thinking about multi-channel in a broader sense. So why design for multi-channel content? We're finding increasingly that we think of the digital experience as largely a website, possibly mobile website, centric experience. Finding that more and more brands and more places that do their work, there's a large swath of user base and customer who only experience that brand through social media platform or through email channels as well, and that the website overall conversion funnel and the overall expansion and understanding of that brand. An example of this is BP. Obviously, a lot of people globally are familiar with BP. When we think about digital engagement for them as a brand, they did a lot of focus on going to where they thought it was. And it ended up that a lot of that was on LinkedIn. So in terms of their audience of engagement within the LinkedIn channel, if you will, for several years ago, they had roughly 200,000 active users engaged with content, followers, if you will, on LinkedIn. Through efforts to publish content that existed within the LinkedIn channel, but not necessarily correlating back to the entire digital website experience, they were able to grow that to 1.2 million. So there's a lot of users out there who really only understood in their interaction with BP as a brand in terms of digital content was occurring through LinkedIn and not through their own, BP website, mobile apps. Related to this as well is the idea of email. A lot of ways, email was starting to thought to be kind of passé or having less value than, say, social channels. And the LinkedIn example above is one. Facebook obviously comes to mind, even emerging ones, well, Snapchat as an example. But according to the Email Marketing Association, which admittedly has a particular bias on this, but in terms of content marketing, email was voted the #1 metric for measuring content marketing success. email in general, in terms of cost per acquisition or transactional cost related to the overall response and conversion goal, actually generally has the best return on investment. It's easier to make quickly, easier to do segmentation, and often has the ability to get that conversion because you have a captive or engaged audience. It's pre-qualified because you've already gotten their email and they're actively engaged in your channel funnel, if you will. So really what we're talking about when we talk about this trend for multi-channel content is we would think about the website, possibly a mobile responsive website, as being that center hub of digital content and digital activity. The reality we're starting to see, and this was emerging in 2016, and I firmly believe is something that is pivoting in 2017, is a reemergence of email, as well as the continued growth of social channels, and eventually to the point of AR and VR as an emerging area that will overtake. There will be users that simply understand your brand, not just from the website, but from the totality of all these pieces. You may have audience segments that only know you through Facebook or only know your Twitter feed. You have to create digital context and digital content that reflects this possibility. The website may be the center of, but it can't be the exclusive content area for things. And then this ties into the second trend we want to talk about, is a content-first design approach. Very often, we would talk about the need of creating a website, the visual design, a style guide, pattern libraries, and then pouring or placing content into that. And increasingly, as we see more and more engagements with our clients, but also when I was working in-house, we're often focused on what is the message and what is the need by audience segmentation and channel, and then designing from that content first. This isn't necessarily a revolutionary idea, but the idea that the content is king and design is queen, to use the monarchy reference, the idea that content drives the conversation and design follows the form that is required for that is a much larger trend. And what we're is with social media and email being a predominant means by which people are consuming content for a brand, is that we're often working with the content at we would refer to as food levels. There's the amuse-bouche, the appetizer, the snackable level, entree, and a complete. The idea being that we'll often start with smaller snackable pieces of content that can lead a conversation through the social media or email experience. Site, either via organic search or through other promoted, social media SEM work at Google AdWords, gives a little more than this, that snackable piece, but enough for you to determine, is this content relevant to me? Does it having a full set of experience, that full meal, so that we don't necessarily have to rely on the content being the fullest and actually overwhelming the user when they're looking for very short, consumable, quick consumption information. So take approach and then saying these are those different levels, the small, medium, large, and then designing the experience on the channel and for that is critical. We have a client now where we're often focusing on, let's write the tweet first, have the kind of mid-tier content that works on the landing page, and then having that longer piece of content. So we're tying in those multiple channels from the very beginning, and we're doing that by focusing on that content multi-channel and then designing the individual experience, the style guide, and we are using pattern libraries to add consistency to that experience. But we're not starting just with that visual expression, but also the overall content-based approach. And we're finding that we were doing this with certain clients, often clients focused, we would say, on a youth, because that's where we thought social media was being very impactful. But we're now getting to a point where this is applying across the board to all audience segments, Organizations that are healthcare and focused on older audiences. We're always surprised that the demographics of Facebook, for example, skew older than a lot of us originally thought. And even with Twitter. And yes, there are social media outlets that are focused on a youth or millennial, if you will, although not a fan of that term. Audience is that more and more people are consuming more and more data on the internet and via digital means. The time to call through the fullest expression of all the content. So we need to give them that tiered approach, and then starting with that content and then designing the visual and experience related to that is often the approach we're taking and finding makes the most sense. To help aid us in that tiered approach, what we're seeing is something that started really with Pinterest more and more standardized. This is not a new trend, but this is a trend that has reached a point of such wide acceptance that I don't think we can no longer think of it as faddish or something, but a trend that does largely exist. And three examples here of a card-based display. A card display often for that middle ground. You know, if we have just the tweet or the Facebook post or even Snapchat video that is just small and singular, the middle is often being expressed in a card-based approach. Pinterest first started with this in terms of their general approach and layout. But then we have a client in the United States called the Foundation Center. They pull together all the information related to philanthropy and foundations for the United States, whether it's information. They have a lot of very important information, and people don't have time to sift through everything. So in a combination of search-based behaviors, but also card-based behaviors, we're able to bubble up that middle ground. We even see this with SNCF, the French system as well. There's a lot of transactional and small pieces of information that a tourist or a resident looking to travel across needs to understand. The card-based layout, the smaller-based approach, gives them a good digestible piece of information to understand this, and this is the information I need. If they need information, there's a link through to get to that depth. But by a quick scan, they can get a larger sense of, am I in the right place? And is my query, is my question, is my need being addressed? So three very different examples, much in the consumer-facing public area, Foundation Center, semi-technical, but also public, and then the French Railway, SNCF, focused on, while generally the public as well, but very much in a transactional approach. Of all these together, you can see they're all providing a quick glance, a way to assess, is this where I need to go, what I have? Works couples very well with that social media approach and also having that depth of information. We're always talking about those three tiers. Cards are a great way of expressing the tier, and they're not new, but we're seeing that they're kind of the default de facto now. And a lot of this is ascribed to the rise of mobile and mobile devices as well. The card itself translates very well to multi-platform, whether it's even as smartwatches slowly take off, there's a way to reconfigure this card-based arrangement for those smaller screens, up or down. This also couples very well with another trend that is kind of counter to the card-based piece, and it's trends in typography. Typography is a fundamental approach to visual design, and the need for it is everything. And one of the now is the capabilities of HTML5 and CSS are allowing many of the things that we used to do in print design are now and becoming very approachable and doable within a digital context. So what we're seeing is largely, for example, that text as an approach is becoming much more bold. Just H1 has to be a size 36, sans serif font. we're starting to be able to use much more expressive typography. You know, the use of web typography, which is not new, but pushing that into newer directions. Things that feel bigger, more. In the example here, helping the homeless, hungry. Again, there's a human touch to this typography, and it's not just laid out in a simple grade fashion. Action Fame, which is related to Oxfam in some ways as well. Again, using expressive typography, part of the live text, so that we're getting that SEO value of it, the vintage hope, and discover as well. But again, these are all large, they're branded, they feel that they are creating a presence for your brand that just isn't the same as having a standard header image or such. And the way we're moving away from that as well is also that we're customizing that approach to the content. So for Vice News, and talking about the recent discussions of immigration in America, Welcome to America in this case. But again, that is not just text on the page, but in that hero image space, so that it feels part of a cohesive whole. Same with the example that's highlighting some of the examples of Dada. I would argue that the Dada art movement historically, as well as some of the Bauhaus movement that we saw mid-20th century, the design principles are catching up in the digital space now. And the things that we used to be able to do with Bauhaus learning in print, or the Dada making and breaking the grid, the Distill movement even, these art movements are now being integrated into our design movements, and the digital space is capable of doing these things. Seeing that what we're also doing, speaking of Dada, is using type as image. This is live text, but it's also being manipulated digitally to allow more expressive. We're putting more motion and animation into things. We're also showing, I'm a huge professional cycling fan, so as you can see, being part of the cycling club, the content here is well integrated with the image. It's not just on top, it's not just above or below. We're holistic manifestations of a brand impression, of a hero space, to allow for larger headlines, customizing for content. Typography just doesn't have to be body copy on a page anymore. It can be used in the space to create emotion, to create movement, to create a sense of the whole for a brand. And we're seeing that increasingly in hero spaces, in landing page design, so that if this is the only way that someone conceives your brand, because they came in from social media or they came in from a email referral, they're getting a sense of a dynamic impression of your brand, because the typography, while still conveying a message, is also conveying brand and brand value. With this, we're also seeing a trend that I think a lot of people caught a lot of us by surprise. The movement of the idea of skeuomorphic design, the idea that a notepad should look like a notepad, or that design should look like the physical manifestation of what the digital analog is. Apple famously, in their update for iOS 7, elements and went to a completely flat design. But well ahead of them was Microsoft with its Metro or flat design, and Android's material design approach. What we're seeing is the idea that we're eliminating shadow, we're eliminating depth, we're eliminating references to literal objects, and going with a simple, focused, flat design approach is actually starting to wane. It's reached the point where flat design has been around long enough that we're starting studies that indicate, for example, it doesn't give enough affordance to new users. They're not, when everything is flat, there's not necessarily the same affordance. People don't know what is the button and what is just supporting content. What is headline and what is call to action? So we're seeing an emergence of a decline of flat design, elements that are starting to come back into things that give us a little more depth, are a little expressive. The best example of this is the trend from postmodern, from the Bauhaus modernist movement into postmodernism. We're well beyond that in the digital space, But what we're seeing is more and more design approaches are focusing on the idea of adding texture and of increased depth. Now, we're not going back to the spot where we have huge drop shadows. And when we're using duotone or gradient, plain duotone, basically what we're doing is we're saying we're isolating and standardizing the color schema to two base colors, red to green. We're seeing this in some of the examples on the slide now. So as typography can be expressive, we're putting more texture. So it allows for some depth while still not necessarily abandoning some of the flat approaches. As we see in this example, the National Park Foundation states, the word parks has the texture of the tree rings to be evocative of the outdoors, and the Park Foundation. That's expressive. The support the parks call to action stands out as well. Spotify was a leader in this several years ago, actually when they were 15-year in review, and they went to the duotone approach. So Viva Latina or Rock This. The examples here are using one color and then transitioning to black. Instead of grayscale, it's a color to black scale. And what this does is a little more depth, but also allows you to unify the overall appearance so that the idea is things can stand out but still be visually. There's more and more focus to content you want. Publicis, the global design and advertising agency. A subtle gradation here to go from the very light orange to the red. Again, it's giving some of that visual interest and not necessarily just flat. But again, not moving to the point where, one of the recommendations we often give as moving away from flat design is not to return to the gradient or efforts we did in, say, the late 90s and early 2000s, where we're using 3 or 4 different bright, fully toned colors. What you're seeing in the for 2017 is we're taking color gradient and focusing on an analogous color scheme, colors that are next to each other on the to red or green to blue. Or what we're doing is doing the duotone, so it goes from the single color black. Doing this, it's subtle but impactful, but not so loud as to detract from the message. Balder, the last example, so the idea of just Balder is a specialty foodstuffs and grocer in the United States and the East Coast. And what just on their, they've got new summer squash available at their markets, is just a very subtle color background that lets that headline stand out and that call to action to stand out. Spotify is doing it to maintain that. These are distinctive but connected things to listen to. Publicis is so message comes across, agency of the year, but it doesn't get lost in a sea of flat color, because whenever nothing comes to the fore. And the decline of flat design allows us to reintroduce visual hierarchies that some were critiquing the flat design. Which brings to the next trend, moving from the idea of let's find ways to move the flat, printable, even staid layout, and more to that of asymmetry. We're seeing more and more asymmetry emerge as a possibility design. So first and foremost, the idea that, and this absolutely harkens back to a lot of modernist work that we saw in print, but able to do now. The idea of an incomplete or broken grid. Yes, we have a very gridded, precise, but we're that just break that grid completely to call attention to things. So in the example of the company, we're looking at the lighting headline that calls attention to it because it's breaking and violating the grid. We've always been able to do this easily with negative margining applied to CSS rules. We're finding ways to do this and do it responsibly so that it has to be a simple gridded layout is on the decline. that for things of importance on a website or on digital experiences, that we can break this grid. Breaking the plane goes into this as well, as we can see, multimedia guides, for example, and the Polish culture ministry as well. What we're looking at here is, the hands of the dancers are breaking out of the space that's contained. This creates that movement throughout the piece. And we need to start thinking of the website not just as a solid state, that there is this kinetic movement throughout. And this trend is emerging. And I think we're going to see this now from just thing to where it's kind of expected. It is something that is not new, but it's new to digital design, and is something that is going to vary a norm. We're also seeing example in the upper right-hand corner, use of diagonals, information, breaking a plane and cutting on a bias. So it's not just all square. It's not all just predictive. The dynamism to an approach, so that biggest thing we often worry about is when everything has square corners, it gets very predictive. So you're much more likely, through eye tracking studies, we've verified this, that people tend to skim content, having an incomplete or violated grid. And by doing things, even curves, we're more likely to put the user's eye down, and they're much more likely to notice the content contained within. There was one study done many years ago that talked about calls to action with rounded corners, and recall of what the call to action was on those with the subtly rounded corners was the search focused eye into the content. Whereas when everything was lined up square, the idea was you're creating perfect grid lines for the eye to skim down the page. We're seeing asymmetry, breaking that skimmability and focusing content where we want to go, to a call to action, to a hero space. And not to say that you shouldn't use the grids. We're of course going to maintain those grids, but what we're also doing, when judiciously used, diagonals, incomplete grids, breaking the plane, we're able to call attention to the things we want the user to pay attention to. The other example here is something that we're seeing increasingly, really, as they're focused on greater audience or product segmentation, and the idea of split screen designs. When going to a website or going to a digital experience, we're also splitting out the idea that we can bifurcate and segment the audience, and we can get them focused things they want to do. We have to be judicious in this because we don't want to have 1,000 grids across the top. But that you can quickly segment the audience based upon task. It is increasingly becoming common. And here you can see the duotone approach being applied as well to help simplify that experience. I want to acknowledge that we did also get a question in, and they're asking, what for you the 3 main aspects X role? What are you looking for in more UI than design, for instance? So for me, it actually rarely fully separate UX, UI, and visual design because our clients are but in many places, design, UI, and UX role. When we talk about the UX role, we often are really, part of it is focused largely on UX and user research first and foremost. And the big aspect for user research in this is understanding what is the need of that audience or that need of that user. So when we talk about breaking a grid or we talk about a design trend, it's making sure that we have enough information from talking through UX research, whether it's prototype testing, whether it is, when I worked at Crate and Barrel, we would often go into and follow users, the digital through the in-store, the multi-channel experience. So often with the UX aspect of the experience, what we're looking for approach. We're looking for or a discovery of an insight that we haven't gained just from the trend analysis. What can the user apply to the overall design of the experience? Very often, our UX people are doing experience mapping. What is it like to go and to get to a page that has these design trends in them? And then we craft user interface experience based upon that journey map, that experience map. Thank you for the question. And remember, you can always answer the, feel free to ask questions. Trend want to bring up, and this actually ties into the question of the overall UX and UX research approach. Mobile-only design. This is really just starting to emerge, not a widespread practice, but absolutely something that we want to make sure we cover. Why is that? 25% of the world is mobile-only right now. In most LDCs, developing countries, for example, there are quote-unquote leapfrog technologies. A mobile phone, for whatever reason, is the primary means of gathering digital information. This is not just some developing countries. In the Western world, in the United States, for example, 10% of adults are mobile only. They don't own a desktop or laptop experience at home. They may use it at work, but their experience is mobile only, and that's 10% of our population. The other thing is when we talk about time on digital, when we're doing, engaged in digital activities, in the United States, 65% of that time is on a mobile device. So really what we're focusing on here is saying, we've talked about mobile first and about that content and the small, medium, large approach. We used to say, well, let's start with the small and mobile and then move up. There are others that say, start in the middle and move out. What we're actually seeing increasingly is more and more starting with mobile only. They just do that quote unquote small piece because that's really all their users are engaging with. The most noted example of this is Instagram. Instagram actually has less functionality and less content, if you will, on their mobile, web, and web desktop experience. Engaging through their mobile app actually gives you the fullest experience. An example of this is they roll out bookmarking, the idea that marking a post as something that matters to you, that only exists in the mobile app. And you can do much more engaging, even more management. So it's not just the consumption of content, but the creation of your account and the management of that account. Those transactional are much more robust in Instagram's mobile experience. They took that, they actually, in all honesty, didn't have a web quote unquote experience for a long time. It was something that was just added a few years ago. And we're seeing increasingly that for certain brands, where that transaction and that consumption of information is in totality, small consumable bites. A mobile approach is something to consider. And very often when we're talking about mobile experiences with our clients or with the people with which we work, we're often asking, is that full quote unquote desktop experience required? Sometimes it absolutely is. Increasingly, we're finding for to convey, this covers everything in that mobile only experience. And very often, a very focused, small mobile only experience is much more rewarding and frictionless and yields a higher conversion or engagement from user than looking at solely just a entire traditional desktop experience. The desktop experience still has value, but at this point in time, it's time to ask yourself, do we need this full encyclopedic history for a consumer-facing brand? Possibly not. Switching gears slightly, the next trend to talk about is that of microanimation. This is something that has been slowly happening over time as CSS allows us to do more animation. The wider acceptance of SVG, scalable vector graphics, as well as just idea. As we had more and more flat design, animation was that way to help reinforce some hierarchy. And we're not talking full animation, for example, like we would think of the old Flash design layouts, but smaller things that allow for just greater to content that matters. It also allows us in a flatter design to have more whimsy and to call attention that matter. So we've got 4 examples here of just simple micro animations that fall into a variety of categories. See is in the area of navigation. As we go to either hiding the navigation or putting things behind what we call menu, the 3 lines, we want to create more affordance so users understand this is something to engage with. So we often burger to a back button, a simple small animation that displays what you can do and raises that awareness of points of engagement. Navigation is great for this because increasingly we want to focus the navigational pieces, often putting things behind an off-canvas display or in a drop-down. The sliding effect combined with the change of the actual understanding of what the user needs or want to do. It's the same with calls to action, whether it's actively showing the time of downloading button, or when you hit submit and you see like a email airplane flying off. There are many examples of actually putting these on the calls to action to create that sense of understanding and whimsy, but also to the importance of this very counters are much more increasingly used because we want to show people that data and information matter, but just showing the number itself often doesn't convey the sense of gravitas or the scope of things. We have one client where we're trying to show they're involved in trash pickup on waterways, on beaches, on riversides, to let people understand how we those waters. And when you're engaged within the app itself, you can see that there is this dynamic. So there's a sense of we're doing something important and it's incrementing up. You're part of a larger whole. And the counter creates that sense of dynamism. And these things are generally pretty straight to do in CSS. The actual animations are easier to do, and much more important, particularly as we move away and maintain flat design. The last one is an example that actually started years ago with this in their OneNote app, but for those who are in graphic design, pen-based UIs experiences often focusing on the idea of a radial menu, a single button that when you click it out, exposes all the other pieces underneath. Now, from a perspective of how do we do this, radial menus only tend to work when you can convey the meaning of what's under the radial menu in a graphic way. Image, music, document, video in this case. It doesn't necessarily work when you have to have a very based approach. Now, use of iconography often allows you to use a more universal approach if you have multilingual audiences, which we often do. So you're not necessarily translating a multi-language. And this radial-based approach often works. It also conserves space. But again, this animation of expressional content from a simple action allows us to expose much more functionality in a way that is engaging learning. Idea of just multisensory experiences often increase brand impression, and it's not just the verbal reading of language, but it's also the visual reinforcement of the animation. Both of those together tend to increase recall and allow users to understand and repeat what they've done. So when they have return visits, they have that sense and understanding of what's going on. animation is going to be integral to the digital experience moving forward. We can't not consider how can we do these. Now, the caution with this is we always want to have it be just enough. We don't want to do so much so that users, you do so much motion that you get motion sickness. You don't want to have it be so overwhelming that it confuses the messaging. It's like an information hierarchy. We want to maintain a hierarchy of action and interaction animation on the page so that there's an important one and secondary one thing is all at the same level. Trend number 9 that we're talking about is design patterns. Design patterns. This breaks away from just the traditional idea of just a simple style guide. When we talked about the first and second, first and multi-channel, we talked about creating content and then putting that content into design patterns. What we mean by this is when we talk about we take accepted approaches and pre-deciding what are the types of content. The visual design pattern we had done, for example, have the traditional styling information. We also talk about when we display types of content, in this case, on the right side, store blocks and cards. We have 3 main ways and rules associated with when do we display this type versus this type, as being able to respond to responsive needs. The idea that the navigation has a predictable pattern. If we're talking about story, that is, it needs to lead to deeper content, we have one way of displaying and creating that, so that when new content is created, we have visual design patterns and UX patterns that reflect those needs and those conversion points, allowing us to basically ways that already decide, so it's easier to make and create. And the idea of, and this pulls together a lot of other trends that were emerging over time. Many of us are familiar with Bootstrap as a front-end development framework, and that matters as well. These are the Zurb Foundation approach as well. Overall, what we're talking about is taking the visual style guide that we often would pull together for digital experiences, the front-end frameworks that we're working with, as well as common user UX UI patterns that we frequently see, whether it's a list element versus a card, the idea of search results being displayed in certain ways, the idea that there's a consistent visual type, the design pattern approach. This also ties in with a trend that was emerging called atomic design, where we to most complex so that we can make decisions intelligently about what we need to apply. In effect, what this allows us to do is when we digital experience, we're not starting from scratch and doing a custom experience every time a new landing page or a new mobile app or a new email template, even social media banner ads. We've got design language and patterns and frameworks to build this quickly so that we can ideate and get feedback from users, in terms of what we're doing. The design pattern also allows us to more clearly and intelligently do A/B testing on digital experiences that have been launched. So we can get that feedback back and revise the pattern and revise the content within the pattern as well. The general approach of atomic design plus frameworks plus UX research feeding into overall patterns of experience allows us to create these overall design patterns to quickly ideate. And it's going to get to the point where it will be cost prohibitive to have to do it as a custom styled approach every time we wish to create new content. And this allows us to reuse intelligent components without making everything custom and not making everything identical. We're not copying entire pages, we're copying components and pieces within pages. And the mixing up of those within the framework allows for a tailored experience that is without completely doing a cookie cutter approach to the overall piece as well. The last of the we're going to talk about is truly something that is emerging and is not necessarily widely adopted, but we're going to increasingly see AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality. And what we're seeing this is this is becoming another channel. If we think about social, if we think about email, website, mobile apps, augmented reality and virtual reality is another emerging channel that allows us to convey the meaning of our brand and the transactional pieces that we want to do in another way. And it's not starting by creating unique, but the reality is as the tools get more affordable and more widely spread for use, we're going to see this being done coupled with other expressions and other channels. The example, two common examples that I think one will be very, the other is not, is a global not-for-profit called Charity Water. They do a lot of focus on making sure that clean, clear, healthy water is available to the entire population of the world, globally focused. At a fundraiser that they held this past holiday season, handed out all of their major donors a virtual reality headset and walked them through what is the day-to-day life for a person who's living in a sub-Saharan Africa drought-stricken area. No clean water, no easy access to water, and what like. But then they also did the transformative storytelling to focus on what is the experience like when Charity Water is able to come in and help them dig for wells, create reservoir and irrigation systems to help, create that overall experience. So with that in mind, they create, they get on this virtual, and it was such an immersive experience that we're much more able to convey that storytelling in an approachable and again way. Now, admittedly, I will admit this, it looks silly. You've got this headset on and you seem like you're ways. You are quite literally in another world. But what I'd say is this seems strange to us. Just and even last year, many people globally were going around the country looking for Pokemon. This is an example. Overlaying a new digital experience into your reality. We're giving additional context that adds additional understanding into your actual reality. It's augmenting it. And the number of living in the Washington, D.C., to see the number of people walking around catching Pokemon, friends who are in London and Paris. Same thing, visiting them, a global phenomenon. So with that in mind, the virtual reality being silly is, the barriers to that exposure within augmented reality already melted through a popular virtual augmented reality thing like Pokemon Go. The same thing is happening with Charity Water in this example of virtual reality. It'll get more affordable and more commonplace and will not seem strange. So we're rounding out on time here, and I do want to leave time for questions as well. But just a quick overview. These are the trends that we see either coalescing or emerging in the 2017 timeframe. Multi-channel content, the idea that it doesn't exist on the web page, but in some non-traditional are going to take have greater importance. Content first design, the idea of tiers of information hierarchy developing based upon that. Using cards as that middle tier approach. The idea of typography being more expressive and the decline of flat design and the emergence of more type and visual hierarchy and as well. Use of asymmetry, mobile-only design, animations as well, increased use of design pattern, and then lastly, we were just talking about augmented reality and virtual reality. We have minutes remaining, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may emerge. We've got one already. How do we approach persona design? Do you advocate for persona-based design on what they do and not based on who they are? And the answer is yes. We've often found demographic or psychographic based persona is interesting, but often we found that when we demographic based personas, we often had a lot of overlap in areas of tasks they want to accomplish. So when we develop personas or customer archetypes or user types, we're often focusing and advocating on personas that are based on what do or we want them to accomplish in this digital experience, not necessarily who they are, although that matters. We're leading the conversation with what do they want to do and what are the points. It's a very good question, particularly as you're starting to think about multi-channel design. The demographic are less and more what do we want them to do on this specific type of engagement.
Thank you, Steve. I also just wanted to say thank you for sharing this very interesting presentation. There's a great deal to think about here, and I received a couple other questions that I'll toss out to you.
Oh,
and we'll hang
please.
on here for another few minutes. One question that came up is, for those companies that are looking to hire more UX designers, what are the criteria that you would recommend they look for in a UX designer?
So when I'm hiring people for my team, and I've been pretty consistent in this, first and the technology stacks and the approaches and the trends are always changing. So by the time someone learns something is the most important thing I look for when hiring is just a general curiosity. They need to understand and look that what our assumptions based on now, yes, there are universal design principles, but the application of those will change over time. So we look for curiosity. I also, to be honest, look for generalists more. You do need specialized skills, but the idea is that often going to switch role and do some base UX research. And then that research has to translate into interaction design, whether it's wireframing or programming, or even the digital design, as well as, even if they're not a full-on graphic or visual designer, to understand the approaches of UI design. We want someone, we call them T-shaped people after the letter T. I want them to have one or so strong areas that they're very excited and highly skilled in. General understanding of the entire UX lifecycle. And those are the things we're looking for. I'm looking for highly curious, T-shaped people who say, this is very difficult to find. More often than not, it's like finding some specific tech. It can take months, and you'll talk to a lot of people. It's not an easy environment now globally to recruit UX people, because everything is so quickly. By the time you get a job description up, sometimes things have changed. Any other?
Another question here. This is says you mentioned prototype testing. How else would you recommend we make sure that the design approaches we take serve our target audience?
Sure. So the prototype testing, often we need to think about the cycle of development, and whether you work in a traditional waterfall or an agile, iterative sprint-based approach. The ideation portion and validating concept, we need to think about testing during the itself and post-launch or post-introduction. Prototype testing is one way. My background is also technology, so I do a lot of ethnographic observation work. How are people engaging with the product or service now? What insights can we glean? That works really well. In addition to prototype testing, we'll often do unmoderated or moderated remote usability testing. We will do tree testing, which is often based on validating the labels or structure of navigation schema to make sure the pathways of people are good. I'm also a huge proponent of UX people understanding Google Analytics or Omniture to see how people are actually engaging and being able to then synthesize the information they see. So let's take the analytics information, take our work, and then also testing. The other thing is testing doesn't need to be formal and rigid. We often will do what we call just research, which is really just getting to the end user, or survey work. If we're doing a digital redesign, having a simple pop-up question pop-up that basically says, did you find what you're looking for? And if not, what were the barriers? And then simple segmentation questions. A simple 3-question, survey often yields a lot of information about validating the direction and approach that needs to be taken. So and paper prototyping works. You don't have to be the full. Quite often, we've done a lot with just simple pulling people in, walk through, a paper prototype. It's almost as much information as the full-on prototype test, and can be done at a much faster pace and lower cost. That's a very good.
All right, and we have time for one more question. I have here a question from someone I know to be a marketer, and the question is, how can marketers become better versed in principles of UX design? It seems like there's a lot of opportunity for marketers to work more closely with designers.
Absolutely, and one of the reasons I'm at Beaconfire RED, my firm now, is we take an integrated approach. And when I'm doing a redesign for a company, I actually will pull in our marketing staff. So for marketers to get up to speed in the UX UI space. One is, very often the professional organizations in the UX field are often very fragmented, but the Nielsen Norman Group, NNG, Jared Spool's UIE, acronym stands for, there's a lot of information. But to be honest, one of the best places to start to see what's going on, medium.com. A lot of the UX profession has migrated their discussions of what's trending, what's new, what challenges are facing people to medium.com, and just following the things that are tagged UX or UI design. Admittedly, quite a bit of it will be on the tools that are used, and that's of less value to a marketer. But in terms of understanding, the overall user experience design, and in most cities in America, there's something like Code Academy or General Assembly. They often will have single-day workshops that get you a broad understanding of what's out there in the UX space. Since there's so much breadth to it, they also tend to have courses can scale up on what you need to do. Start with the medium.com. Look for Jared Spool's podcasts and webcasts. Then look at General Assembly, single-day workshops or multi-week classes. And between all of those, you should be able to get a sense. The other thing I highly recommend is I try to bring marketers along to me when I'm doing my UX research or when I'm doing client engagements. It's one thing to read it in a book or to read it on a site. It's another to partner with UX personnel and team members and see what they're doing and the decisions they make. Seeing it firsthand is always a way of doing things if you can do that within your organization or environment.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. So this concludes the webinar. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us. We had well over 55 attendees today. This is a great opportunity for us to showcase one of our partners. Beaconfire RED is an easy partner and an implementer of our content management system. Steve, a good friend of ours, we thank you so much for taking the time to share these insights with us. A lot of practical application here too. I feel like there's a ton that we could take away from this and start testing with our own companies and our own audiences. I did want to just thank everyone here and let you know that we will have more and more webinars from Easy Systems throughout 2017. So please look out for more invitations. And lastly, if anyone wants to reach out to Steve directly, Steve, would you like to post your email address for anyone who has additional questions?
Yeah, I will put it now into, I'm posting it in the webinar chat. And I'm typing really slowly, I apologize. Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
so it's steve.mackley@beaconfirered.com. And then Beaconfire Red is beaconfire-red.com. We have not just me, but an entire UX team and digital marketers, as well as technologists who can answer questions if things come up during the discussion today that you don't want to get clarity on.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend everyone take a look at Beaconfire Red. They do incredible work. We're very happy to have them as partners. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Have a great week.